leadership and wine, that was sort of the call. We're all, this is a, how do you see those two words coming together in the same sentence? And today we're drinking wine. And those of you who had an opportunity to order the Moritzen wine or have another wine that you are drinking currently, I'm going to I'm drinking the Zinfandel. Maybe Clay, tell us a little bit about this Dry Creek Valley Zinfandel. Looks like Michelle's got the Sauvignon Blanc going there. What do we got here?
Like I said, we've got good taste because we both picked the same wine to drink today. I think a lot of what we choose to drink in wine can tell us a lot about our personalities, or at least from a winemaking perspective, I think it does. And, I love Zinfandel because it represents such an unbelievable challenge to make. And Zinfandel is it's a very frustrating varietal. It tends to have really large berries and thin skins, and it ripens unevenly and has a really unique bunch morphology. And like any great wine, it only grows perfectly in a very, small microclimate, if you will. But what I love about Zinfandel is that, to make that varietally correct, perfect, balanced Zinfandel, it's just an infinitely greater accomplishment than doing that with other varietals. And, there's so many parallels to what we're going to talk about today, the rewards that come from hard work, that come from challenges, and why, we develop character through adversity. And it's so true about the development of a grapevine, most plants, and why terroir and geography are so important. But this wine, 2018, was a quote unquote normal year in wine country, minus the fires. We didn't have a direct fire here in Sonoma County, but unfortunately the biggest in the history of the United States north of us. But the growing season was fairly normal. So it wasn't, we didn't have the huge heat spikes that we've had in other vintages surrounding it. And we tended to have a little bit cooler evenings. So as we'll talk about later, our diurnal shift, maintained itself. And what I love about the 18 Zins is that they have a freshness to them. They have a vibrancy. There's acid. They aren't cloying and overripe. And sometimes when we get too much heat, or too much of anything for that matter, it can lead to negative effects and the ultimate outcome. But with 18, even though the crop was a little bit bigger, there's a softness, there's an elegance to the wine, and then they're lifted up in that bright acid. So that would be my, very surface level, discussion on the Dry Creek Zin.
Well, thank you for that. I'd forgotten about 18 being such sort of an even year without fires and so forth. So that was a gift. But I see that a couple of folks are drinking Sauvignon Blanc. So maybe say a few words about the Sauvignon Blanc too, which I have to say, just true confession, I ordered the box of 3 wines, and I've already polished off the Sauvignon Blanc. So I mean, not today, but, just over the last few days. So tell us about the Sauvignon Blanc, Clay.
No apologies needed. But Sauv Blanc, one of the things I love the most about the Sauvignon Blanc is that it's probably the varietal that is the least manipulated. So when we talk about terroir, there's so many things that can influence the flavor of the wine outside of its terroir. Its fermentation vessel, the use of oak, malolactic conversion. And Sauvignon Blanc is one of those varietals that typically is not aged in oak. It doesn't go through malolactic conversion. So you really get a chance to taste the terroir. We have an amazing site here in Dry Creek Valley where we grow our Sauvignon Blanc, and it's right on the creek. So you have different soil there. You have more of the alluvial fan, than the hillside constructed soils. And you have a cooling influence within a certain proximity to that creek. So you've got great drainage, nice cool air, but you still get the sun that Dry Creek Valley is known for. And what it does is it gives that wine balance. You have, a ripeness, so there's some beautiful fruit, some citrus fruit, some stone fruit. But again, it's a little bit more center palate focused. We don't let it go through malolactic conversion. And so it's just a really bright, fresh, clean wine. And we very lovingly refer to it as our porch wine around the winery.
Our porch wine?
Porch wine.
Okay. It's because
nice wine to sit and sip on the porch, right?
I love it. Yes. Well, I guess that's what happened yesterday. We just drank down the Sauvignon Blanc. It was beautiful. Yeah. Thank you for that. Really, really appreciate that. Oh gosh. Well, we've gotten a little bit of like who's here and what we're drinking, and I want to move on to frame a little bit about what we're going to do in this time together. And you all have received an email with some PDFs in them. Maybe I sent out some hard copy things. I don't know if anybody has received them yet, but if you received something in the mail, I'm looking, I'm seeing nobody's received theirs yet. Okay, obviously slower mail delivery these days, so you'll get it and you'll definitely appreciate it once you get it. But if you have the email and were able to download the PDF that you received, that would be something that we'll be looking at while we're together. So take a look at that. I can share my screen if you don't have access to that. But that'll just, we're gonna go through two different pieces today. And so we're not gonna go through the whole terroir piece. We're gonna go through just the geography and the climate. So while you're looking for that, let me just introduce Conversations in the Vineyard. As you mentioned, Patty, it's so interesting these days to try to lean a new way of being when when your events and the things that you do are normally in person. And so Conversations in the Vineyard is normally an in-person, a wine country experience for leaders that sets up a framework for sustainable leadership by using metaphors that we find as we walk in the vineyard. And we look at those metaphors through the lens of the seasons. So normally we would gather, we would pour this beautiful wine and we'd walk in the vineyard, and then we would talk about leadership. We would share our stories. We talk about the metaphors that we see coming through in the vineyard, and then we would think about how those metaphors can give us a vision for a lifetime of leadership that does not include burnout. So when we talk about sustainable leadership, it's like sustainability in the vineyards. It's using those resources that God has given us without depleting them, so that they can go on for a while. So environmentally, sustainability is all about using your resources in such a way that you're not depleting them, but they're still available for the next generation. So these are the kinds of things that we think about, we talk about in Conversations in the Vineyard. And of course, we drink good wine, thanks to Moritzen today. But of course, during COVID, we've shifted to an online experience. So here we are. We're doing this together, and it's kind of a new way of being. But anyway, we're glad to be together and continue with the idea of metaphor and leadership. So, what is a leadership metaphor? Metaphor, as you know, is sort of it's taking something that's a physical representation of something that's sort of a symbol. It's representative of something else, especially something that could be an abstract concept. So metaphors really help us take an abstract concept like leadership and make it more accessible or more visible, if you will. And using a metaphor then gives us a framework to sort of hang things on. It gives us an idea of something physical. The abstract piece is more representative in a metaphor. And there's lots of ways to think about metaphors. There are a lot of sports metaphors and analogy. Sports is metaphor. Clay talked about this, and Clay has played football in college with the Clay. Help me out here. Oregon Ducks.
Ducks, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so there's a lot of things that we can learn, a lot of metaphors that we can learn from um, other areas, other arenas, and sports is always a good one for that. But today, and if for Conversations in the Vineyard, we use the metaphors coming out of the vineyard. So metaphors, Jesus used metaphors. We call them parables in some ways. So it's the idea of Jesus saying, I am the door, or I am the bread of life. It gives people an idea, something tangible. Even the story of the prodigal son, or the lost sheep, or whatever. These are stories, these are physical things that help us understand a bigger principle. So today we're talking about terroir as this metaphor, as this context for leadership. So I'll just, because all of you all are leaders and you've been in this arena for quite some time, I'll say that Conversations in the Vineyard has been mostly focused on what happens in the vineyard during the seasons. And the Terroir series is actually a more fundamental, a more foundational metaphor than the seasons in the vineyard. So I'm excited about the terroir metaphor, and especially working with Clay on this metaphor, because it's a very fundamental piece of who we are as leaders, is thinking about the terroir piece. So I just framing that for all of us, terroir is the piece that happens before you get to the vine growing in the vineyard, right? All of that geography, all of the climate, all of the soil has been taken into consideration. And that's fundamental to what is actually happening in the vineyard season over season over season. So understanding that geography, climate, and soil is really, it's paramount to actually planting a vineyard that is sustainable over time. So what's terroir? It's a word, it's a French word, and we live in, so those of us who live in California, or those of us who drink wine, we've heard this over time. It's a French word that describes the environmental context in which the wine is produced. So terroirs, how a particular region's climate, soil, and terrain, or the geography of that area, how those three things kind of work together and ultimately affect the taste of the wine that is grown in that region. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that from Clay in a minute, but the bottom line is that terroir will give a different flavor to the same varietal planted in a different place. So if you have Cabernet or Pinot Noir, let's call it, planted in Willamette Valley, it's going to taste different from Pinot Noir that's planted in Russian River. The terroir is what makes that happen. So as leaders, and this whole metaphor is so fascinating, because this is really the context of our leadership. Terroir is that metaphor for context. As leaders, we're planted in a particular context. And it's sometimes a little hard to tease apart the pieces of terroir, just like it's a little hard sometimes to tease apart the context of our leadership. But we're going to just take some time today to try to do that. We're going to do our best to sort of really focus on a couple of things. We're going to look at geography or topography, and as a metaphor for sort of those visible expressions of our life. And we'll get into that in a minute. We'll look at climate as a metaphor for sort of more the historical, social, environmental, economic climate. And we're going to talk about things that we have influence over. The first time I talked to Clay about this idea of terroir, Clay, I don't know if you remember, but I said, "Oh, I was thinking I was so smart. You know, terroir is the three things. You know, geography, climate, and soil." And he said, "Yeah, and human influence." And that just opened up a whole new sort of realm for me to think about that concept that terroir also has this element of human influence. So Clay, the last time we did a webinar with Clay and Martz and Winery a few weeks ago, we talked about Clay's family story and how that is so intertwined with this idea of geography and climate. But Clay, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I would love to hear your thoughts about this idea of terroir, and especially as it relates to geography and climate. Maybe go over a few things with us about that from the standpoint of the vineyard.
Well, you've obviously been paying attention because you did a beautiful job describing something that is very difficult to describe. In fact, the French would say that it's impossible to describe it. And like the metaphor you're referring to, it's trying to explain all of the unique things that have happened to us in our life that make us who we are. And that's one way of thinking about terroir, is all of those things that have happened, not just to the grapevine, but to that place, that have made that place what it is. And I think sometimes it's hard for us to wrap our minds around, because we're often talking about things that happened, millions upon millions of years ago. And, we can't believe that 2020 is not over yet, the challenging year we've all experienced. And, we're really, 7 months into it, 8 months, I guess, as of today. And yet, the things that shape Sonoma County to be such a great grape growing region, you can really trace back to about 20 million years ago. And again, you have to wrap your mind around how big of a number that is. 20 million years ago, most of Sonoma County was under the Pacific Ocean. And so you had all of those maritime influences in the soils. And for those of you that like to drink Pinot Noir from Russian River, you may have heard of the term gold-ridge soils. Well, what gold-ridge soils are ancient seabed. So when the Pacific Ocean receded 20 million years ago and the San Andreas Fault started to push up the coastal range, a lot of those soils got trapped in these interior valleys, and you have literally, ancient seabed trapped inside Sonoma County. 6 million years ago was the next big geologic event in Sonoma County, and we had what we refer to as our Ring of Fire. There were 3 major volcanoes that were active in Northern California and about 16 minor volcanoes. So again, many of you that live in the area, you've probably heard of Mount St. Helena, you've heard of Mount Tamalpais, you've heard of Geyser Peak. Well, those are all active volcanoes, and we had a lot of very small active volcanoes. And then about 3 million years ago, the Russian River started to cut its way through Sonoma County and started to redeposit all of that igneous rock that was deposited by the volcanoes. It started to redeposit all of those sedimentary soils that the Pacific Ocean left, and also started to move around some of the rock that was created through tectonic activity. Everyone knows that we have a proclivity for earthquakes in Northern California because we have all of these tectonic plates that come together here. Well, that also helps shape our soil. And when you start to think about that context of what happened in the last 20 million years, it's interesting to think that Sonoma County has exponentially more diverse soils. In fact, just in the little county of Sonoma, we have more diverse soil than the entire country of France, because France's geology is much older than ours. So their geology really took shape about 60 million years ago, and that 40 million year advance they had on us serves to somewhat homogenize the soils over a long period of time. And again, I think it's hard for us to put into context just how long of a period that is. And one of the questions people ask me is, can we change the soils? If the soils aren't good enough to grow a certain varietal here, how come you just don't change them? Well, that's like trying to say that we can change God's will. This is what he did to create this on this site. And we can add nitrogen to the soils. We can go in and make soil amendments, and whether that's phosphorus, boron, magnesium. But to truly think that we can change, the soils is a falsehood. And soil is so much more than just a mixture of nutrients or a combination of rock. It's where the soil is located, the topography, as Susie was saying, our soils, 12 inches deep, 24 inches deep, 48 inches deep, because all of those things play into not just the soil composition, but water retention, moisture, microbiological activity. They're all interconnected. So it's kind of a little overview on, Sonoma County and our unbelievable diversity of soil that we have here, and really how young our geologic legacy is, even though we're talking about something that's 20 million years old.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. I heard you say that a few weeks ago, and I've tried to recount that to other people because it's so amazing. So thanks for sharing that with us. One of the things that I'm curious about, because we're going to talk about topography and geography here, and that really has to do with sort of mountains and valleys and just the actual curve of the land, if you will. What are some of the things from a human influence standpoint that you think about when you look at, or you think about planting vines, for example, on a mountain or in a valley? What are some of the things you think about there?
So I think when you talk about the human aspect of terroir, there's some obvious things that come to mind. How do we plant a vineyard? Do we plant it with the slope? Do we terrace it? Do we change the vine orientation? Do we try and, move dirt? Do we, pull topsoil off and flatten the hill out and, put it back? So those are more obvious. Oftentimes, I think a really important factor in terroir are the decisions that humans make about what to plant. You
Mm.
know, if we would have planted Cabernet in Russian River Valley, Russian River Valley wouldn't be as famous as it is today. When you plant, it took some trial and error, but we found out over the years that, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay grow unbelievably well in Russian River Valley. Well, that was a human decision to do that.
Mm.
Then you mix in rootstock and all the other factors. But I think one of the less obvious aspects of terroir that isn't super common, but it's something that's very important in my life is, we live in Dry Creek Valley, and my family's original homestead is in what is now known as the Rock Pile area. Well, the Army Corps of Engineers decided about 50 years ago that they wanted to build a lake. And so they took a lot of land from my family and other families, and they built the Warm Springs Dam, which created Lake Sonoma. And Lake Sonoma is shaped just like a horseshoe. So you have this 2,500 surface acre lake that's in the shape of the horseshoe. And that ridge that runs down in the middle of the lake is this totally unique terroir because of the presence of that lake. And would it be a great place to grow grapes if that lake weren't there? Absolutely. But is a very different place to grow grapes today. And you think, you have a body of water that's over 200 feet deep. So you have a very different climatic influence because water actually provides pretty good insulation. You have absolutely no fog on the ridge line running down the middle of the lake because the lake is so deep and holds its temperature so well. As the air heats up during the growing season, you create an inversion layer. That temperature variation creates an inversion layer, which sucks the fog down. So it's pretty amazing to think about the impact that, humans had by deciding to build a dam, and now you have this very unique growing region.
Yeah. So interesting. So human influence is really, even in the geography that we think of as so static in a way, actually, is something that we manipulate as humans. Yeah, thanks, Clay. That it's a much bigger and really fun story. And if you ever get up to Dry Creek, you've got to get up to Rock Pile and see what Clay is talking about. It's fascinating. But let's turn our attention here to the sort of the metaphor of this. What is that? So what? I mean, what does that mean for us? And by the way, hi, Bob Lips. I'm glad you joined us. Having a little technical difficulties there.
Yeah, good to see you. Good to meet you, everyone. Sorry I missed the first few minutes, but really glad to be here. Totally fascinated with this stuff and just riding on Susie Lips's coattails. And good friend Clay. Clay, good to see you. What a privilege to have you hosting this with Susie.
Great to see you, Bob.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, so what does that mean for us? You know, if you had your card, if you have your PDF open in front of you, we can think about this metaphor of geography. And again, the whole idea of terroir is really about our context. Well, there's inner context, what's happening inside of us, and then there's outer context. And today, really, our geography metaphor and our climate metaphor, we're going to be focusing on things that are sort of outside of us. And what's the hardscape of our life? What are the things that are sort of creating the contours of our life? So if we think about these visible expressions of our life, some of the things that I put on the PDF would be sort of race or gender or physical capacities, family of origin. We're a small group here, so we can all contribute to this, but what are some other sort of hardscape things of our person as leaders? What are some things, anything else sort of come to mind in terms of those kinds of things in our life that might be dictated to us in a way?
This isn't really a personal factor, but it feels like one that everybody's talking about right now is just some of we think about geography, the pandemic we find ourselves in is not something we can largely control, but it certainly is a really significant contextual factor in how we function day to day. So I don't know, Susie, if you want more of the person level kinds of things, but you know, when I think about things in the environment or the space around us that are significant, that one feels especially relevant.
You kind of broke up there, so I didn't catch exactly what it was that you felt was. Are you talking about like where we live or our political climate? I'm not sure what. Can you reframe that? You're
I can
muted.
try to type it too.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
Can you hear me well now?
Yes,
I'm not
yes,
sure what's
yes.
happening today. I don't usually have connectivity issues, but today here we are. I was just saying that the although it's not a person level factor, the global pandemic feels like an environmental condition that is really significant right now in shaping the ways that we live and lead in really practical day-to-day ways.
Yes, yes, and I agree with that, and I'm kind of gonna hold that piece for our next conversation about climate, because I feel like we even use the word climate to talk about the climate that we're in, the political climate or the social climate. So that as we begin to piece together sort of our puzzle, if you will, or weave together the strands of who we are in our particular context, the geography or the topography seems to be something that would be a little bit more sort of individual to us, you know, and so when we think about what are those expressions of our life, you know, and what is the human influence part that comes along with that. So Clay and I talked about this, you know, when they have a hill that they are planting vines on, they go with the hill. They plant the vines to go with the hill. So that's a human influence that they have on the geography. So as I was thinking about this, what came to my mind, and I love your reflections too, is the idea that, you know, I have some influence on, you know, what I do with my my gender, my race, my family of origin. I can add some education into that. Some of that is something that I can choose. Not everybody gets that choice, but for me, that's been a choice. So when we think about the topography, that I feel like the geography, or the way the landscape, the contours of that, feel a little bit more like, you know, who I am and where I've kind of come from. And then as we get into the climate, and again, this is what's so hard about terroir, because it's so intertwined, right? It's all together. How do we lead, keeping in mind who we are and where, you know, the time that we're leading in. So let's go back to that geography piece and think about what those visible expressions are of our life and the kinds of things that we can control there. Maybe yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm a little slow in getting up to speed here, but as I'm reflecting on the words that you have on your page here, and reflecting on what you and Clay just talked about, the elements or terroir, it really occurs to me that it's, you know, we have all of these elements sort of at our disposal, maybe not all of them all of the time, but there's so many of them. And it comes down to a choice, how we're going to use those different elements. So choice is a big thing, and that's a discerning thing, and that comes from experience and with risk, and from, you know, errors and successes. And then the other thing is how much energy we decide to put into things. You know, as I look at, you know, 200 wineries in Sonoma County, there are some that are hugely successful, very focused. They pour a lot of energy, and then there's others that just kind of cruise along. And so those are two things that are under our control. It's the choice of what we do with what we have, and then how much energy we put into them. And both of those, I think, are very pertinent to us as leaders and business people.
It's really good. You know, what do we do with what we have? I think that's a really good question. You know, we have been given a certain number of things. You know, we've been given, you know, from a physical standpoint, we've been given rock pile. What do we do with rock pile? What do we do with Dry Creek Valley? What do we do with Russian River? What do we do with Napa? Those kinds of questions of like, what do we do with that? But the fact remains that rock pile is something. Rock pile is not Napa. Russian River is not Napa. Napa is not Dry Creek. So we have something that we're given, and what are we going to do with that? So let's just to sort of take a couple minutes. What I'd love to do is, if you're on your computer, maybe open up a Word doc, or write it in your PDF that you received from us, or if you have a pen, grab a paper, get, you know, whatever you're going to sort of take your notes on here. And what I'd love to do is just take a minute and make a list of the visible expressions of your life. And sort of think about things like, you know, for me, I'll think about my gender, my race, different kinds of physical capacities that I have. And we'll take a time and make a list of the physical, visible expressions of our personhood. And then put a plus next to those things that you consider advantages, and then minus next to those you consider disadvantages. And, you know, in these days, we've really talked about that a lot. And then circle the ones that you consider to have the most influence on your current season of leadership. So I'm just going to go ahead and, for myself, I'm opening up a Word doc here. I'm going to set my timer for like 1 minute, and we're just going to take 1 minute, and we're going to make our own list, and then we'll share with each other what we've come up with on that minute. So ready, set, go. Think about some human influences, things, choices that you've made with regards to education and so forth too. Okay. Cancel. All right.
Well, Susie, I'll go.
Yeah, go, Patty.
Okay, so I think if, I don't know if this is what I did, but what I realized is some of the things that could have been negative earlier in my life have become more positive, visible expressions. And I'd say some of the negative I might have seen myself as a single woman as a negative, as a single mom as a negative, as a woman of color as a negative. And just in the last few years, as I've gone through the spiritual direction program, I'm beginning to see that as more of a positive. That diversity allows me to, maybe embrace people who could identify with some of those versions of who I am. And I think one of the positives was when I semi-retired from a job, I decided to go back and get my spiritual direction certificate. And that has proved to be not only personally, a growth and a positive thing, but I've just seen that in my small practice that I'm beginning. So that's part of it, I think, is growing into the positive of who I am that I used to not see as very positive. So it's growth for me.
I love that. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Anybody else have anything that they feel comfortable sharing?
As I went through my list, Susie, I was aware that things had both plus and minus marks on the very same piece. That being a woman in ministry has had both negative aspects to it and decidedly positive. Family history, stories, my narratives that have had both negative impact in my life and have been strongly positive in the way I relate to people or whatever. So as I went through the list, I thought, wow, it's interesting how many of these had both plus and minus marks, except for race. And I thought particularly right now, the whole white privilege thing is pretty clear.
So good. Thanks, Patty, and Patty, two Patties. Yeah, the positive and negative does show up often on the same line. And yeah, oh gosh, okay, I could go off on that, but anybody else want to share what came up for them? Terry, you're muted.
How about now? Yes. Okay, great. You had to circle the things that were most important. Is that was one? I thought I heard that right. I was struck. I was just, when I was running through a list, one of the things that came to mind to me that is unique about each of us and influences our choices so much is our longings and desires, and that paying attention to those, how that matters. And I was struck by the influence that has in my life, has had in my life, and not always a clear trajectory from when I laid out sort of the elements of the terroir. Not necessarily would you add those dots and say, oh, clearly moves this line, but rather a strong awareness of a movement of desire, longing, and God I would connect God in with that prayer, stirring in those things. That has been part of the movement for me.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I mean, part of our, I don't, our longings really are part of the contours of our soul, right?
Mm-hmm.
And thank you for bringing that up. That's beautiful. I love that. Yeah, and as we pay attention to those, we will, to just sort of pull the metaphor, and we'll plant differently,
Mm-hmm.
right? We'll think about different ways of planting as we pay attention to the contours of our life. One of the things that I put down on my list was I'm a third culture kid. I grew up overseas, and again, that's been mostly positive, but it had, as I think about that gives me an outline of something that I need to pay attention to, and how I want to sort of plant in my life according to that contour in my life. So, yeah. Well, this is the kind of thing that we could spend many more hours talking about, but I want to move on to our second piece here, and that is climate. And Michelle, you sort of really beautifully opened this up for us earlier on the idea that climate as a metaphor is really a more sort of what we're living in. But I'd love to hear from Clay a little bit, because as we tie this metaphor together to something that's more abstract, I want to hear a little bit more about the concrete piece of climate. So Clay, give us just a glimpse into what is that? I mean, why do we even care about climate as it regards terroir? What is it, and why do we care?
Climate's an interesting thing because while we have specific climates that we are accustomed to, and whether if you look at the zone maps of the world, we have an expectation of what the weather in Northern California is going to be like, but it changes, right? And that's why we put a date on the bottle, is that 2018 was a very different growing season than 2019. We had 5 years of extreme drought that we just came out of, and those years of 12 to 17 were pretty extreme. So every aspect of the climate is hugely influential in that year's development, and not just the simple things that we think about like rainfall. Do we have adequate rainfall? But when did the rain come? How did it come? Did we have 2 huge storms and we had our average rainfall for the year, but it wasn't spread out? Did we have flooding as a side effect of those storms? Fog. We talked a little bit about fog before, how influential fog can be, in the maturation of grapes. The lack of humidity here in Sonoma County, and why don't you grow grapes in Alabama? It's too humid, it's too hot. I mean, all those little aspects, really define, true quality. And I think there are grapes grown in all 50 states in the United States. There's wine made in all 50 states. But I think we all understand, and if you don't take my opinion, that the best grapes grow here in this very small swath of latitude around the world. That you look at the latitude that we're on, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and you compare that to Europe, I mean, there's a reason why. And we have similar climatic patterns that affect it. And so the terroir was developed, millions of years ago, but this climate pattern was also developed. And it's more variable than our soils and our topography are, but it's still part of that same, almost undefinable system.
I remember you said the other day, and I haven't done any research on this, Clay, but you mentioned something about a diurnal shift, and that seemed to be important to the conversation on climate. So, what is that, and why is it important?
So, diurnal shift is just the degrees in temperature that shift from the high of the day to the low of the day. So if it's 90 degrees, it's going to be, I think, 95 here at home today. But, I always look at the low, almost more important than the high, and it's going to get down to about 58 tonight. And so, check my math, but that should be a diurnal shift of about 37 degrees. And for anyone who's ever lived in the South or lived in anywhere near the equator, you get a diurnal shift of maybe, 10, 12 degrees if you're lucky. My wife is born and raised in South Africa, and when we go back to visit her family, they may only have a high of 85 during the day, but that's with 90% humidity, and their low temperature at night is 78. And so we're so fortunate here in Sonoma County to have that unbelievable diurnal shift. And one of the reasons it's so important is there's certain compounds, phenolic compounds in the grapes that are bleached out by sun, and then every night when it cools down, they recover. And so those phenolic compounds are what makes one of the things that make our wines so age-worthy and complex. The cool nights also help us to retain acid. And so when we think about one of the things that constitutes a truly great wine on a world platform is wines need to have acid. That acid not only gives them freshness, but gives them longevity and really helps us to ascertain, those varietal influences, those unique characteristics between Cabernet and Zinfandel. And in the absence of acid, when the wines become very monochromatic and flabby or overripe, they just start to taste very similar. And, one way I always explain it is that if I showed you a Cabernet berry and a Zinfandel berry and a Pinot Noir berry, you'd be able to tell the differences very readily. They look different, they taste different, different colors, different thicknesses of skins. But if I showed you a Cabernet raisin and a Zinfandel raisin and a Pinot Noir raisin, they all look like raisins and taste like raisins. And while some of those decisions to leave fruit on the vine is a human aspect, having that diurnal shift, having those cool nights, letting those acids respire, letting those phenolic compounds recover every night is one of the things that allows us to grow these world-class wine grapes and also maintain the integrity of the fruit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So interesting, yeah. And so the climate, a grape growing climate, you think about Italy or Spain or France or California, they're all about in that same latitude, right? And the climate in those latitudes is similar, and this diurnal shift is maybe similar in those areas.
Same latitude, and the other thing that they all have in common is think about their proximity to a major body of water. So whether that's the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, by and large, you have a very large body of water, if not, and then some other areas like the Mosel or, the Rheingau, you have these very large rivers that flow through there. So, water plays a big effect on the climate, how it affects the fog, how it affects the humidity, how it affects the diurnal shift. Water's a big part of that. And all of the, pretty much all the great wine regions in the world, are within, certain proximity to a major body of water or a major river.
Interesting, yeah. So the water creates sort of this particular climate within these geographical areas. So interesting, yeah.
It affects the way the fog flows. I mean, that's, as you mentioned earlier, why is Pinot Noir so prevalent in Russian River Valley? But you have, Dry Creek and Alexander Valley that are in the same equidistant to, the ocean, but the valleys run parallel where the Russian River runs perpendicular to the ocean. So what does that do? That allows that fog to come up that valley because it has access from, where it feeds into the ocean. So just how that river created that topography that now shaped the climate of that region. I mean, they're, like I said, they're very intertwined.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of thinking about it. So the geography or the topography and the climate really are linked.
Yes.
And so the perpendicular versus parallel valleys make such a huge difference in the climate. So I hadn't even thought of that, Clay, but thank you for bringing that to our attention. That idea that topography and climate, I mean, that they're so intertwined. But so if we sort of turn our attention then to sort of this metaphor of the climate, if we actually use the word climate to talk about things like economic climate or the social climate or whatever, right? So we intuitively think about that as something that is this climate force. How do we think about that in terms of a metaphor? How would, I mean, I'd love to hear from you guys. Michelle, you sort of started that conversation, but maybe pick that up again a little bit with the idea of the things that create a climate around us as leaders.
Well, Clay, I love when you talk about this connection between geography and climate, because I do think that's so true for how we function as leaders. Can you hear me still? Okay. I think when you think about the realities of a climate or context, the example I gave before, one of many possible examples, is this idea of COVID. Well, as part of our current climate, but those pieces of our own personhood interact with that climate in really unique ways. My set of circumstances and that are unique to me are different than friends of mine in other contexts in this time. And so I feel like those two are so connected that it is almost impossible to disentangle them. So I just love the way that you describe that. In a really practical sense with the land and the geography really shaping the climate in many ways and having a strong influence on it.
When I think of how climate applies to business and leadership, the reality is that unless you move, climate is there. It's more powerful than you. It's ever present. You can't change it. It's something bigger than we are. And so it doesn't make sense to fight it, but to work with it. And, we can do certain things that allow us to be insulated from adverse times of the climate. We have air conditioning, or we have storm shutters or things like that. But unless we're going to really cooperate with the environment, the climate, and build our model, our business model, our leadership model that flows with the climate and is not constantly fighting with the climate, we're going to have a tough road. And so the more we can recognize the climate, understand the climate, and work within the climate, I think it really makes for, I hate to use the shallow word success, but like we can be much more successful in our endeavors.
So well said. Cindy, I'm curious about, you're a filmmaker. Tell us a little bit about climate and how things are impacting that particular industry right now.
Yeah, the climate is tough because it's already really competitive. So I think it's impacted the already slim amount of things, getting made or considered, because now it is even smaller, right? There's only so many productions that can happen, especially in California. A lot of people are going outside of California to film. So I think the climate really affects the storytelling that comes out of filmmaking. It affects which stories get told, it changes kind of the focus and the quota for what gets put out there. So the climate really heavily affects it. It affects even shows that are supposed to come out at a certain time, but then because of the bigger social climate, then it gets pushed back, because they have to find the right time for it to be received well, so it's not a total flop. So it has everything to do about climate, I think.
Hmm. So I'd love to hear sort of some conversation or discussion around this idea of sort of my personal geography, me as a, whoever you are, whether you're male, female, white, a person of color, that's sort of your geography, your topography. How is that intersecting right now with climate, with what's happening right now in our social environment, social, political, economic, just pick one. How is that, how is that interacting in your life? Is that a big question? It's a big question, isn't it? Yeah.
Maybe a painful question or complex question.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big one. Terry.
I can just say that the climate is impacting the people that we lead too as leaders. So it's changing what they need, and it's changing what is possible to offer. And so it's requiring a great deal of rethinking and changing the delivery model, what's offered. So it's pretty significant because it's impacting. I mean, we have this common climate, but also different pockets have a different climate. And so attending to the climate of the person that we lead or serve or our customer in a business context is also part of the climate we have to pay attention to.
Well said. I love that. And that microclimate piece, those of us who have ever lived in San Francisco, we understand microclimates, right? It's just, you can go over 2 streets and it's sunny or it's foggy. And so that idea of microclimate, Terry, that's really beautiful. Like you're really stewarding not just the climate that you're in, that your geography, that your personal topography is interacting with, but you're also stewarding the climate that is impacting the people and their own personal topography. Kind of, yeah. So if we were going to do this on a personal level, we could, let's just do this together instead of doing it on a personal level. Let's just name some of the things right now that are sort of the climate in which we are trying to lead. Michelle, you mentioned pandemic. I would say that's a big one. What are some other sort of issues right now that are sort of swirling around us?
Well, certainly for pastors that we serve, the pandemic and the rancor, political rancor, and how to deal with opening or closing churches. I mean, the sense of there's almost no right answer. There's not a clear path. And if ever there was a time when it's like the next steps are not clear, I would say that's part of what we're in. So a different kind of pressure, a different kind of, I was thinking of how the topography or the geography plays into how we deal with our climate. Whether we're more resilient people, whether we're more creative, whether we have backing of other people. But I think those are just ever-changing needs, ever-changing focus.
Mm. Yeah, that's good.
I was even thinking, first when you asked that, Susie, I was thinking about some of the racial dynamics that we are trying to work through, and then also another one is, it feels like in this climate, the kind of leadership skills that are most relevant might be different than other years, than other vintages, if you will. I think we're in a time when adaptive leadership is kind of coming to the forefront, more than some of the more kind of operational models that just say, these are the steps, you just have a vision and you implement it. And
Oh, we lost you, Michelle.
stated rules and parameters don't seem to be as relevant in this particular situation. I think that's unbalancing a lot of leaders in this.
Mm. So well said. Yeah, thank you for that. That's the unbalance of the climate. And I'm just going to go back to Clay, because I know that what can we learn from the vineyard? Because I feel like we've had fires, we've had droughts, we've had too much rain, so in some ways, every year the winemaker has to deal with a new climate, if you will. What can we learn from how, Clay, how you guys deal with these ongoing changes every year? How do you think about that, and how can we learn from how you guys really deal with these incredible changes in the climate?
I think you have to look at every every instance as an opportunity, and shame on you if you don't learn from it. There's always the opportunity to gain knowledge from whatever the occurrence is. And while a year like 2017, we may not have experienced that extreme of a heat spell that early in the season, but I remember 2003, where we had a lot of heat. It was after Labor Day, but very close to Labor Day. When you had the drought, there was a very steep learning curve early on in the drought. But if you're going to adjust your farming practices and adjust your winemaking practices, to coax the best attributes out of the vineyard, you're learning from that historical event. So I think taking that gained knowledge that you have from all of those different climatic effects that we've seen in our shared experiences is a huge aspect of it that we can learn. And also being prepared. Those are some key things in leadership, is that everything that we can to be prepared. And in 2019, when we had the fires here, before the fire started, we had the power shutoffs. We had a generator. We had ordered extra dry ice. If in case something happened with our generator, we wanted to be able to cool down the fermentation. And sure enough, the first power outage, everything was great. The second power outage, our generator failed. And we were so glad to have that dry ice on hand, as a backup to our generator. And so you had the perfect metaphor there, right? We thought we were prepared. We even had redundant, kind of line of defense. And in the midst of it, when the generator failed and we ran out of dry ice, we had to, be creative. We had to invent. We had to be entrepreneurial. And a lot of what we did was we thought 200 years ago, people didn't have power. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have the things that we have today. How would they have handled the situation? And so, learning from, the past, I think, is a huge part. And if you look at all the craziness going on in the world today, there's a lot of examples of us not learning from the past and not learning from the struggles that society has faced for generations now, And, we get to a point where, people are fed up of, the same thing. I mean, the old definition of insanity, right, is doing the exact same thing and expecting a different, response. And so people are tired of being looked at as insane.
Yeah, yeah, and then that goes back to your comment, Michelle, about adaptive leadership and how we just keep trying new things. But I love what you said, Clay, of sort of beginning to think about what we might have done in another era that might have, given us some clues about what we might do going forward. Well, let's just take a couple seconds to, we've talked about the issues, we talked about the pandemic, and the maybe the I don't know if anybody named it, but the Black Lives Matter issue. Maybe just take a 30 seconds to write down your top 5 sort of issues that are swirling in your particular context. And what we're going to do next week when we get together, we're going to sort of combine these things that we've put together with our soils metaphor, and we're going to sort of create a little bit of a map, if you will, of our own personal terroir. So you've created a little bit of your topography. Make a list of the top 5 things that are influencing you right now, and we'll combine all these when we get back together again next week. So open up your notebook, open up your Word document. I'm going to go 1 minute, go for a start, brainstorm the issues that are shaping this moment in history for you, prioritize them in terms of impact for you, 1 being the greatest impact. And then put a little circle or a cloud around issues that are currently having the biggest impact for you. So go for it. There goes our timer. If you're not quite done, keep going. I've got a couple more seconds here. We can go. I see everybody's still writing. Okay. Obviously, you can keep thinking about these things and these concepts through the week, but what are your top 5? What are the top 5 climate issues right now for us?
I'll share again really quickly. I think we're in a time of really, climate of divisiveness. You're either pro or con in so many of these different issues. I mean, even as much as, pro-mask and anti-mask, But I think what comes up for me is just the social injustices, including Black Lives Matter, but just other injustices I think are now being able to come to light. And my friends and I have been watching films and talking about films a la Windrider and issues that are brought up there. And one that seems the theme is the prisons and the injustice of people who are in prison either falsely or you know, they're in prison for years for a minor crime. And, you know, and I think it's unjust because if you look at people who are being in prison, it's usually people of color too. So, so anyway, our small group of people who are watching films, we're looking at how do we not only empower each of us, but maybe empower ourselves as a group. And we've decided to kind of get involved with the whole prison and injustice. There's an innocence project going on. There's just a different, you know. So, and it's hard in the days of COVID. But I would just say, as Clay said, preparing ourselves and learning for the time that perhaps we can go out and actually make a difference.
Wow, you named it right off the bat. Divisiveness. That's quite a environment that we're living in, isn't it? Yeah. Who else? What else? What else are we living with? What's our?
I think one of the challenges, and maybe it's a byproduct of all of the things going on in the world today, but is uncertainty. So much uncertainty around, you know, when is this going to end? Is there going to be another stimulus package? Can we, you know, eat indoors? Can we eat outdoors? You know, am I going to get a stimulus check? I mean, there's so much uncertainty that's permeating every aspect of society, and that leads to a lot of emotion in people, and you know, fear. And fear is a really powerful tool that typically drives people in a negative direction. And a lot of terrible things are committed out of fear. And I think that's one of the challenges with all the uncertainty is if we knew that there would be, you know, a vaccine in X amount of time, you could have that to look forward to. If everyone knew that they should wear a mask, if it was definitive, just make it a rule, you have to wear a mask. Then, but there's mixed messages coming from different places, and that leads to uncertainty. And I think that creates a lot of divisiveness because of that.
Well said. Thank you, Clay. Yeah, uncertainty.
Terry. Another one that touches on, I think it's interconnected with those two, is interdependency. That it's so clear we are not islands. We don't have as much control over our climate, our topography, anything. And decisions we make we have had more freedom to make decisions than we have now. There are constraints placed upon us out of this environment that we're in, and so the clear interdependencies in our context with teammates, that our interdependencies are the interdependencies with what our government is telling us we can and can't do, our interdependency on the healthcare workers and situation. I mean, it goes on and on and on.
Well, I love that, Terry. That's such a great way of describing it. Even the terroir metaphor really speaks to that, how we can't actually sort of separate out each strand. Really, they all, you push this one part of the mobile and the other part goes up. You know, it just all is so connected. Really, really important part of our climate right now. Yeah,
I would add with that just a general malaise, like disillusionment. I think we see it in and out of the church, but just as probably goes with the fear and the uncertainty, but a real disillusionment that wherever you stand in almost any issue, is there really a good way forward? Is there anyone, who do we trust? Things that we have felt anchored us don't feel like anchors right now. And I don't know, maybe it's like after a fire, that kind of thing, but it's like things that seemed to be constant or firm terrain are not So there's a sense of disillusionment.
Wow. Yes. I see Cindy nodding down there. I feel like our millennial generation has been particularly disillusioned in this moment. Um, yeah, it's well said. Thank you, Patty.
Even just piggybacking on that, I think the idea that people can only sustain so much change at a given time.
Mhm.
And for most people, they're pushed right up against that threshold right now because the terrain is shifting. And the things that felt stable are, in fact, not stable. Or the things that felt probably that we lived under the illusion that were predictable. Now we are seeing that illusion being removed in some really tangible ways. And I think we're all kind of at, or many of us are just at our capacity level for how much change, how many layers of change we can withstand in a given moment.
So good. Oh my goodness. You just, how much can we handle? Yeah, this, the climate that we're living in is particularly difficult right now. Does it feel like a hurricane to anybody? I don't know. It's just feels so disorienting and yeah, yeah. That's good. Thank you guys for sharing that.
Thing, can I add one other thing, Susie? Is I think too, you add in this friends and family that really have a different view from you, and just the inner conflict of hearing them speak and trying to understand
Mhm.
and trying to listen and ask questions. But I have some friends, and I'm not so much family, but friends that really have a very different viewpoint than
Mhm.
me, and and that weighs on us too.
Right.
Another.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It that almost feels like yeah, unbearable, in the midst of all this to be sort of separated from people that you know and love. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So we're living in this really interesting climate, and each of us brings we bring our own uh, topography, if you will. We bring ourself into this climate, and this begins to give us some context of how we as leaders can um, engage this moment in our leadership. So, Bob talked earlier about success, and I think it's a word that we throw around, and maybe it's ill-defined in some ways, but at the end of the day, in a vineyard, we're trying to make wine. As leaders, we're trying to do something. As human beings, we become um, we become something. It's not so much about what we do, but it's about who we become. So in this process, we're becoming something. We're becoming leaders. We're creating some kind of wine, if you will. And so how does this metaphor of sort of our topography, who we are, and the climate that we live in begin to give us a vision for leadership? I'll just throw that question out there. I know that we've just got a couple minutes, but give me just reflect with me for a minute on how this metaphor might inform our thoughts about leadership going forward.
It's kind of in the vein of having high emotional intelligence. Is you have to take all of these external influences, how all of the people that you are leading, your employees, your congregation, those you're mentoring, and you have to gauge each one of their temperatures, gauge their personality, and really cater to them. Just like in the metaphor that we have to take into account the soil, the climate, what happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow. There's so many external influences that we have to be able to bring them all together to make informed decisions. And what works for one employee won't work for the next. What works for a type A personality doesn't work for a type B personality. What we do for Pinot Noir is different than what we do for Cabernet. So I think being able to take all of these different aspects of terroir and be able to use them to the best of our abilities, but to suit each of our people that we're trying to lead, or in the case of wine, each of our varietals, each of our sites, each of our vineyards.
Yeah, really well said, Clay. And I know that you guys run you and Emma. Emma is the winemaker at Mauritz Winery. And by the way, just really appreciate the leadership at Mauritz. And of course, it comes from the top. We know how this works as leaders, we sort of set the temperature. We bring who we are into the leadership context. We lead within a particular climate. And this is what we're trying to understand. This is what we're trying to sort of suss out in this conversation here. But I have to say that Clay and his team really do a great job of doing this at Mauritz Winery. And, buy Mauritz Wine, man, because they're they're doing a good job over there. They're taking care of their people. And we all know that this is not an easy thing to do. And just really appreciate how they do that. So thanks to Clay and Emma. We'll talk to Emma next week. And yes, we've loved Mauritz Wine. I'm on my last glass here in Dallas. We'll have to wait to get home. But anyway, Bob's he's saving one for me in the other room. Okay, that's awesome. Anyway, I want to say that, Conversations in the Vineyard exist to help leaders figure out a framework for sustainable leadership through the metaphor of the vineyard. And this is just the beginning of a conversation. So next week we'll talk about soil, and that really takes us to a whole nother level. And we'll talk with Emma next week on what that might mean, and then we'll put it all together for us. So stick with us, come back next week, and follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, the whole thing. We're so happy to be able to create a community of people who care about leadership and who care about sustainability and sustainable leadership as we move forward. So thanks a lot for joining us. I want to respect all of our time. I know some of you are heading home as Clay or heading to dinner or whatever. So there's so much more we could unpack here. We'd love to have you up to the vineyards, actually. Bring your leadership team. We'll spend some time together and walk in the vineyards and really unpack some of these principles together. So anyway, thanks everyone. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Patty, Terry, Cindy, Michelle, Bob, and Clay. All right.
Bye.
Many blessings on you guys. Okay.